Seems to me you're one of those people who does blend a mix of theory, econometrics, data. So you're kind of jack of all trades in that regard, and often in the same paper. And I know an area you've become very interested in is uncertainty, and how you build uncertainty into economic models. And so you want to talk a little bit about that research angle and where you see it going and how far you've gotten along the road so far?
This prize I got a few years ago, kind of part of that is you're forced to look back at kind of what you got there, and it was interesting to do that.
It's not just this prize. When you won the Nobel Prize, let's put it that way. So let's be clear about that. Lars is being modest here. He did win the Nobel Prize in economics. So
part of your task is to kind of put your past research in perspective, and so it was interesting to do that. So I think about the first part of my career is the following. I come out of a very special background. I tell people that I'm lucky. I got Tom Sargent and Chris Sims when they were young at the University of Minnesota, and they're like thinking through time series, but from the standpoint of explicit models and dynamic models, and the connection between time series and explicit modeling. And it was a very powerful way to think about things, and at that point in time, fairly novel. And then I take it on to like Carnegie Mellon, where I never actually taken a finance course, but I've taught some. But I learned finance at the same time. I'm trying to write papers with it and learning it from some other energetic young people at Carnegie. But the first part of my career was trying to take insights that I got out of, say, some of the work of Sargent and Lucas and the so-called rational expectations paradigm, which is people love to dump on and criticize, but let me be clear that I think it's been a tremendously powerful paradigm. So the rational expectations paradigm is one in which you adopt a simplification. Behavioral economists and finance people think it's an insight that, individual decision making is very complex and our models don't get all the complexities. Yeah, of course they don't get all the complexities. We build tractable models to do stuff. So the rational expectations paradigm was this useful simplification that we say, well, let's suppose that people kind of figure a bunch of stuff out because of past histories and like that. And then we put off the table the fact policies where we systematically fool people, because that doesn't seem like a very stable policy lever. And I put on the table a way to think about doing economic policy analysis while removing a lever that I think was just fine to remove, that we're going to somehow imagine people's beliefs stay fixed as they change the policy and like that. So I think it was a tremendously powerful paradigm there, and it still remains the most prominent paradigm in economic dynamics. So let me be clear that I was very enthusiastic about it, and it had a huge impact on my research. And so I write these papers in which the economic agents inside our models, the investors, have stuff figured out, and they have everything figured out. And it's me, this econometrician, sitting on the outside that's kind of struggling a little bit.
But this is one step, just to make clear so people are following, goes one step beyond sort of like the player understanding the law of physics, right?
Yeah.
Because if the things he understands are themselves a function of his own behavior, right? That's a key element of the rational expectations world, that unlike physical systems where you might think, all I got to do is understand the world and then we're done.
Right.
I influence the world just doesn't influence me. And so the rational expectations view of the world is that players of this game not only understand the underlying environment, they understand the equilibrium that occurs where their behavior is part of what they understand.
Right, absolutely.
And that's going to be critical for this way of looking at the world.
Absolutely. So that was a very nice part of, I think, Lucas's contributions, was really formalizing this as part of an equilibrium construct to be determined that, I put through a bunch of, kind of how the economy operates, people's kind of so-called preferences and technologies, but also part of the equilibrium construct is this beliefs get determined as part of it, as some simultaneous determination. And it was like, it was a very, I think, deep and powerful insight that I think has had a lot of value to it. So so it became a very useful one for me to use in my empirical work. And I like to think about my approach to empirical work, and this carries over to my econometrics as well, is this idea that I want to do econometrics, even though I'm looking at macro data and financial market outcomes, doing something without doing everything. Once you have an interdependent system, one thing you might argue is, well, I've got to solve out and know all the details of all the system before I can do anything. And the idea is, can you still somehow, even though there's lots of endogeneity, still do something? Can you understand a piece of it without having to do everything? And so under certain sets of circumstances you could, and that gave you a way to think about part of the problem without having to think about all aspects of it. So in my case, it was more about this investor part of the problem, facing uncertainty and facing and kind of how that affected the behavior, the macroeconomy, financial markets, and the like. So I approached this using the rational expectations construct, in which here I'm really using it empirically, in the fact that I'm just presuming that from past histories of data, people have figured stuff out.
So let me be clear. So you're using the rational expectations construct in kind of the way, like, I have a theory of how Lars ought to behave. Lars ought to, in the environment he's in, satisfy some condition. Lars is trying to do the best for Lars he possibly can.
Yeah.
And you're saying the rational expectation part of this is really going to come in because I'm going to assume then in the actual world, the behavior that Lars chooses should on average turn out to be the right response to the environment in which he's found. I find him.
Yes.
And it's not an exogenous type of behavior that's derived from a behavioral theory.
Yeah.
It's part of the equilibrium.
Right. Absolutely.
So when I see Lars in the actual world, it ought to look like Lars is doing what the theory predicts he should do in that world.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's going to be our theory, and we don't necessarily have to take account of where that world came from to understand how Lars should respond.
Yes.
Okay.
And then the empirical content of the theory then comes through the fact that, well, if you look at past histories of data, it better not contradict how people are thinking about. And so it's instead of putting together the whole equilibrium, and instead looking at past histories of data to try to and just presuming there isn't obvious disparities between those histories and what people are thinking.
So one way to think about it is if we were thinking about a firm, and it shouldn't be the case that if the firm says, well, let me change my decisions. And in every period, I'm going to produce 2% more than I am now. The theory should be that should, on average, not be more profitable than what I actually end up with. Nor should 2% less. Nor should any other change in the rule where on Tuesdays I do 2% more and on Thursdays I do 2% less. And
things that you could kind of tell from histories of data are just wrong, then that's being ruled out as part of the investor beliefs. Yes.
So you would say that's kind of the implication of rational expectations.
As was being implied in this empirical work, yes.
In this empirical work.
Yeah. And so, we looked at some of the favorite macro models of the day and tried to show, oh my God, these things aren't even in the right ballpark to try to understand what's going on in financial markets, and then start asking why. The first steps of this were these highly parametric approaches where wrote down, at least from the standpoint of investors, a lot of precision in how they, in terms of the risk aversion and the like, and then shifted to less and less parametric approaches to try to get a much deeper understanding of what the empirical challenges were, and to try to go with kind of much less structured ways. In fact, I found it very advantageous in empirical work to do both, to kind of put a lot of structure on things and see where it takes you, then to remove the structure and see what's left, what puzzles are left over, because then we really understand the phenomenon much better. And I was lucky enough to explore it from multiple angles. But to me, what that characterized was so-called puzzles. And it produced a characterization that I like to think about as the following. The theory of finance, roughly speaking, tells us that. Suppose you have macroeconomic shocks. Macroeconomic shocks are things that you can't average out over the whole economy by their very nature. You think about an insurance company trying to insure automobile accidents. There's a whole big population over there. There's individual randomness in the accidents. They can average across that pool of things. And that's kind of diversifiable uncertainty. Macroeconomic risk is not. And so what the theory of finance tells you is those are the risks that, if you're exposed to, require compensation. Investors, in order to be exposed to those risks, have to get rewards in terms of expected returns or whatever way you want to measure your compensations. So it's kind of this obvious, there's a direct tie-in between macroeconomics and the impact of financial markets.
Assuming that they value what you mean by risk is they value the payoffs less when they're high and more when they're low?
Of course, it's more than just high and low. It's high, it depends on their other scopes of their activities.
When you say compensated, I assume you mean relative to some expected value type calculation.
For instance, yes, right. That's a typical way that we often express the compensations. What's the expected return on your investment given you're exposed to these types of so-called risks? And the way that I like to think about the puzzles coming out of this is those compensations, those so-called risk prices looked really big relative to a lot of standard models.
Can I try to link this up in some way too? Because you talked about these two approaches. One is a kind of parametric approach. One is a very non-parametric approach. In the parametric approach, you had some specific models in mind that would tell you up to some parameters, for example, what those prices ought to be, and the prices that they generated didn't seem to explain the asset prices that we saw.
Correct.
Then in the non-parametric approach, the way I understand the way you looked at it, you found that whatever pricing structure you needed prices to vary a lot in some sense across, call them states of the world, that you had to price different cash flows differently. Pretty far away from just a pure, well, a dollar's a dollar no matter how I get it. It's some dollars are worth a lot more than others, and you characterize saying, look, no matter where those prices come from, they got to vary a fair amount. I think that was one of your key findings that you found.
So that's what we got out of the non-parametric approach, kind of saying, these things have to be moving around. These prices have to be moving around. And there were refinements of...
When you say moving around, though, you mean like some payoffs have to be worth a lot more than equivalent dollar payoff at some other state.
Yes.